Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Jarrell Mason, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Album Cover, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them their flowers while they're here to be celebrated. With me right now, I have a man who is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of the African and Africana American Studies, and also chair of that department at Duke University in the Bull City of Durham, North Carolina. Co-authored several books, taught several classes on Black masculinity, Black pop culture, including a history of hip hop class with Grammy Award winning Your Favorite Producer's Producer and mine, and North Carolina native Ninth Wonder. And also has a video webcast entitled Left the Black, which is in collaboration with the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you, round of applause for Dr. Mark Anthony Neal for coming on Beyond the Album Cover. Dr. Neal, thank you, and it's an honor to have you on, sir.
Hey, I thank you. It's an honor to be on to talk with you today, Jarrell.
Yes, sir. It's definitely a pleasure. And I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there for everybody. I'm a North Carolina Tar Heel fan. We're going to talk about Duke Carolina. I mean, we just beat Miami as of the recording of this podcast. So hopefully we can backdoor our way into the eight NCAA tournament like State did last year and possibly make a run, but who's counting? So let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So I believe you're originally from the Bronx, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, home of the boogie down. Shout out to BDP. So, was academia always something you wanted to go into, or did you have a different career path before going into academia?
Well, academia was not the path that I was thinking about. I'm not sure when I was growing up what I thought my path was. Like every kid, every black kid, working class kid who grew up when I did, your parents, my parents who had not gone to college, the only thing they knew were doctors and lawyers and engineers. So I actually started college with the plan of being an engineer. I went to Brooklyn Tech High School in New York, which is well known for producing so many engineering. It's an engineering school, high school. So I thought I was going to be an engineer, but it didn't play out that way. I figured out that I had a skill and a talent and a love for writing. So I always kind of figured I would be a writer and a teacher, but academe teaching on a college level was not something I was thinking about, when I was in college.
And being from the Bronx, I'm sure you were hearing those early mixtapes when hip hop was just making its foray into the park jams, and then, of course, getting passed from borough to borough. So, what was it like for you seeing hip hop in its early infant stages to where it is now as a global phenomenon, to where we're having college courses on this discourse?
So I grew up in a housing project called the Throgs Neck Houses. And the Throgs Neck Houses was about a half hour walk, a half hour bus ride to Bronx River. So it wasn't unusual to see some of the cats that were doing some important work on the ground level of hip hop over the Bronx River projects to be in my own projects, right? So the thing I always tell folks, when I first heard Rapper's Delight on the radio in the fall of 1979, I already had a context for it because I had been watching hip hop in the street in the park, for at least 2 years by that point in time. One of the guys that I grew up with, we weren't close, but he was tangential. Ike C was a member of Zulu Nation, right? So, we had our own celebrity in our projects, right? So it was something that I saw in a more organic sense, when it was in the park. I, of course, was too young to be going to clubs. So I didn't see that version of hip hop. But, Saturday or Sunday afternoons, cats would be plugged into the street lights outside the park out my window and doing this thing with records and rapping over it, and it was so infectious to me at that time. And the kids that I was growing up with as 12, 13, 14-year-olds, we started making our little pause button mixtapes. We would go out and buy break beats. And we'd loop the breaks by using the pause button on the boombox, so stuff like dance with dance to the drummer's beat, T Connections Groove to Get Down, Apache, of course. This was all stuff that we were playing around in our houses, trying to loop beats and then trying to do our little raps on top of it.
So you were speaking of the pause mixtapes, and for kids, for those of you that are too young to remember pause tapes, I was of that last generation that got that good whiff of that. So it was where you had to go get Preferably, I love the Maxell 120-minute tapes because you could be able to record the full 2 hours. But if you had the 60-minute, you had to make sure you had a steady ear to listen to know when to flip. Now, were you team BLS or were you team Kiss?
Well, I grew up listening to BLS. I remember when Kiss became a thing. So I was always, Team Kiss and Team Frankie Crocker. That's what my parents listened to, in the 70s. I did listen to a lot of Kiss, and then I liked Kiss a little bit more when I got older. And I was in high school because they were playing more, to me, more up to date R&B stuff, and BLS was still kind of playing some older stuff that my parents would listen to.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Those were the the great days where you had Mr. Magic's Rap Attack on BLS, and then on Kiss you had DJ Red Alert and Chuck Chill Out, and it was a battle where do I record one or do I try to risk it all and find a spot to record both so that way I can make some money to get some fresh kicks
Yeah.
on the mixtapes? Because I'm sure that funded a lot of Air Jordan ones, and you knew not to wear them because they're gonna be like, "What's your size?" Your
No,
size, come up off those.
though I got to be honest, when I wasn't trying to listen to the mixtape shows, I was always listening to Vaughn Harper do his Quiet Storm show on BLS, and really the first learning lab for me, in terms of learning about a history of Black music, was listening to Hal Jackson's show on Sunday mornings on WBLS, right? Because he was playing the whole gamut of 50 and 60 years of Black music history, and it piqued my interest in
Mhm.
Black music history listening to his show every Sunday morning.
Oh yeah, Hal Jackson. For those of you that don't know, radio legend Hal Jackson's Talented Teens. Definitely look him up. And now, when you transition from high school going into college, what was that environment like with where you're going in, you're seeing the emergence of hip hop. We have New Jack Swing start to come in. It was really that first time where you had that fresh, young, urban feel, not like Motown, because Motown had the pristine polish, but New Jack Swing was where hip hop and R&B finally got into the center of the room. It said, "Hey, I think I like you. You want to make some music together?" Well, yes. And then insert Key Sweat, Make It Last Forever in 1987.
Yeah, so I was in college from 83 to 87, and I went to a small SUNY school, State University of New York school outside of Buffalo, Fredonia. And, the only Black radio station we really had access to was WBLK in Buffalo. And it wasn't the same as listening to Red Alert or Mr. Magic or Marley Marl in New York. And so for those of us who lived in New York, we would make tapes, air tapes of these shows. And when we would go back to school up in Buffalo, that's some of what we listened to at parties, right? Because there was no mixtape culture on the radio in Buffalo. So we'd be listening to Mr. Magic and Marley Marl and Red Alert up in Buffalo, for folks who had those New York connections. The thing that I do remember is when I graduated and came back home to the Bronx, and hearing that first Keith Sweat album, with "Make It Last Forever" and "I Wanna" and all that kind of stuff. It was such an exciting moment because I think for those of us who grew up listening to R&B as I did, but also had been listening to hip hop, it was like this first bridging of these sensibilities, both in terms of what we're hearing sonically, but also in terms of how cats were representing themselves, how they talked, how they walked, the clothes that they were wearing. So
Mm.
those early days of New Jack Swing with Keith Sweat, and of course Teddy Riley is lacing everybody with these great beats. Obviously Guy, but also talking about I'll Be Sure. And then of course Bobby takes it national, really, when Teddy Riley produces My Prerogative,
Hmm.
and Bobby Brown becomes a major pop star, in the context of that.
Yeah, and I also think we mentioned Teddy Riley, but I also think Full Force kind of laid the groundwork for
Oh,
what
no
was to
doubt.
later come with New Jack Swing. You Dare
No,
Work, Lisa Lisa on the Cold
no.
Jam, UTFO, and then of course they came back even harder after their stuff and did all the pop stuff with Britney, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, early Rihanna before she blew. So we got to give Full Force their credit when credit's due, or else they're gonna kick your freaking
No,
in.
no, no doubt. My senior year in college, me and my roommates, we had this suite And we had up in big letters on the wall, "Ain't nothing wrong but a temporary love thing," right? Because that was our full force jam, for our
Uh-huh.
senior year.
Yeah, but it's crazy to think when you listen to Make It Last Forever and how 87, prior to that, R&B still had that lush, smooth adult
Yeah.
sound. It was really
Yep.
highlighted if you watched the Luther Never Too Much documentary and how R&B still had that bumpy After Five, Quiet Storm, Frankie
Yep.
Crocker
Yep.
sitting in
Yep.
the candlelight bathtub playing the smooth music, but when you hear that I wanna, it just punch you in the face and you're like, oh, R&B will never be the same again.
No doubt. No doubt. No doubt.
Yeah, R&B was never be the same again. And the funny thing about the Make It Last Forever album, I grew up in small rural Eastern North Carolina in the 252 area. And there was this little nightclub in Pleasant Hill, North Carolina, and a lot of my aunts, uncles, they went to this nightclub to hear Keith Sweat perform a lot of those tracks before Make It Last Forever.
Hmm.
Blew up, became nationally. And also a little tidbit for those of you that don't know. Just Got Paid originally was supposed to have been for Keith Sweat on Make It Last Forever, but it didn't make the cut, didn't make the deadline. So
Johnny
Johnny
Camp.
Kemp, rest in
Yeah.
peace, ended up cutting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he definitely ended up cutting it. So, all right, fast forward, you go undergrad, master's, and you get your PhD. Where did the timeline fall for you to where it's like, okay, did you have any preferences as far as where you wanted to go teach at after you got your PhD? Or was it where I'm taking the first school that's hiring?
Yeah, you don't really get preferences that way. Especially early in your career. So, I went into a master's program, got married. Both my wife and I went to graduate school up in Buffalo, fall of 1991. Got a master's degree from the same place where I got my undergraduate degree from Fredonia, and then started a PhD program at the University of Buffalo in 1993. Took me 3 years to finish. Wrote my dissertation in 6 months. I came through graduate school at the same time that there suddenly was this proliferation of AKA Black public intellectuals. So, this is the time that Cornel West is dropping Race Matters. Michael Eric Dyson is dropping his first books. Folks are in the mainstream of finding out who Bell Hooks is with her books like Black Looks and Yearning. Greg Tate, of course, is doing his thing at the Village Voice. Nelson George had been doing his thing, at Billboard, the Village Voice, and other places. The Death of Rhythm and Blues, which was published in '88, was such a critical text to my own intellectual development. I have my homegirl, Joan Morgan, who's writing at the Village Voice, and this is even before she drops When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost. And I describe her as a homegirl, and that's real, right? We grew up in the same building in the Bronx, so I've known her since we were 3 years old, since 1968, with the Head Start together and all that kind of stuff. But I came out, had written this dissertation that examined the political content of Black music in the post World War II period. And you kind of, if you didn't go to a big time program, I didn't go to Yale or Harvard. I'm not coming out of these Ivy League schools. I'm coming out of the SUNY system at the University of Buffalo. So your options, are a little limited in terms of where you can go teach. Also, because I was doing work around popular music and popular culture. I'm doing popular music, but I'm not an ethnomusicologist, right? So I'm not going to be going into a music department. The work that I was doing wasn't legible to folks. They had no idea, what this pop culture, even hip hop. I get out in '96. Trisha Rose's book Black Noise only dropped 2 years earlier, and she's the one who wrote the first dissertation on hip hop, in the academy. So I ended up going down to teach in an HBCU, Xavier University in New Orleans. I was just there for a year, but that was my first gig. And even though it was a place where I couldn't stay for lots of reasons, I still cherish the fact that I would walk into these classrooms every day, and I would have all these Black kids, just
Mhm.
hungry, for knowledge. And also because I was doing work around popular culture, hunger for knowledge that reflected the lives that they were living and the culture that they were consuming at the time.
Yeah, and that was the beauty. Once hip hop broke out of New York and went to other regions of the country, you got to see and hear what went on in other parts. Everything that was coming out of the West Coast with Dre, Snoop, NWA. Then up in Northern California with Digital Underground, Too Short, E40, Hammer, and then later in New Orleans with Cash Money, No Limit, all the bounce stuff, and insert region here. And even though you have the connectivity with the elements, you had your differences based on what region of the country you were from. And I think from my outside view looking in, with me being born in 85, seeing hip hop's ascent from 90 forward, how you needed a Hammer, a Jazzy Jeff, and the Fresh Prince to take
Mm-hmm.
rap pop.
Yeah,
Because I think the argument was rap was still fighting for that respect to be loved as rock, as country, as R&B. And I think they kind of felt that going pop, you would lose the authenticity of
yeah,
that. But in actuality, it actually helped you get more eyeballs, more ticket sales than you could get by being just a regional superstar.
yeah. I still have very visceral memories of that year down in New Orleans and the first time I heard Mystical. And I'm like, what the hell is this?
Mhm.
It's like I have no idea what this is, right? And I'm a New Yorker, right? Born and raised 1965. I've always had an East Coast bias when it comes to hip hop, right? I'm always going to say, with my chest, that the best hip hop, right? And again, it's like being a Duke fan, right? I'm just going to say it because it's what I am.
Mhm.
Um, but I can remember, first hearing some of the stuff coming out of the West Coast. First time hearing Easy, the first time hearing Ice Cube. And I thought, even Ice Cube understood when he went solo, no matter what he was doing out in the West Coast. And of course, Dre was always an amazing producer, right? And in fact, what Dre does as a producer really becomes the mainstream of hip hop production from the 90s going forward. But, when Ice Cube decides to drop that first solo album, America's Most Wanted in 1990, right? He went to East Coast producers, right? He went to the Bomb Squad, right? He went to the same, production team that was doing Public Enemy records because he knew in order to kind of hit in the way that he needed to, he still had to have a certain kind of New York sound. By the end of the decade, the New York sound is no longer the centerpiece of what hip hop is. Whether we're talking about sonically in terms of production, and of course, even the rappers. And, I think it was important for a figure like Hammer in particular, the crossover. And again, he's coming from the Bay Area. So that's not someplace we were typically thinking of in the early 1990s as a center place of what was happening in terms of hip hop, right? Because we just hear California and we're thinking LA, but no, it's also the Bay Area. It's Oakland, right? It's all these other places coming up and down, the state of California that all had their different and unique sounds. I think it was important that Hammer crossed over, but there's no Vanilla Ice without Hammer.
Mhm.
So with these certain kinds of successes, it opens the door to so many other people to kind of chase the mainstream dream, and I think hip hop loses some of its essence, right? I'm sure Diddy would never think of his career this way, but there's really no opening for Diddy to become Diddy without MC Hammer breaking down the walls of crossover, right? Because quite
Mhm.
honestly, you know, we talk about Will Smith and Fresh Prince and Jazzy Jeff and the way that they cross over and they win the first Grammy, but I don't think they were ever thought of as anything other than a kind of sanitized version of what hip hop is.
Mhm.
Early Hammer wasn't that.
Nope.
Right. Let's get it started. I mean, early Hammer, was a couple of things, right? He was a rapper's rapper, right? Not a great rapper, right? Not somebody we talk about in terms of a lyricist, but he was a rapper. And the other thing that Hammer did that is now a lost tradition in hip hop is that he was a song and dance man. He was an entertainer, all right, at the time where Big Daddy Kane was also a song and dance guy, right?
Mhm.
Heavy D was a song and dance guy. LL was a song and dance guy. We don't have that in hip hop anymore. You know, cats who are rapping and also dancing. Of course, now they're all rapping and trying to sing.
Yeah, and with Please Hammer Don't Hurt Him, that went diamond. He was pushing British Knights, KFC, Pepsi, Proper, What You Say, Hammer,
Yeah.
Shout out Q-Tip and the Tribe Called Quest, and just how it was like a wide buffet where you could get Hammer on your plate, you could get Too Short on your plate, you could get De La Soul on your plate,
Absolutely.
get Third
Absolutely.
Base on your plate, you could
Absolutely.
get Jungle Brothers on your plate. All these different palettes are all going to be cleansed and they each had a different sound, different feel. You could get PE. And
Right.
what was it like for you seeing, the movement of Black nationalism with PE, X Clan, and Poor Righteous Teachers, Brand Nubian, that whole movement? Then we also had the synergy with A Different World and how that spiked the enrollment of HBCUs during its run on NBC, and just seeing, kids are really taking to it and saying it's okay to be Black, know my heritage, know my culture, and I want to be educated as such.
You know, and I'll specifically talk about Public Enemy. The reason why Public Enemy was so important to me because it was the moment where the music caught up to what I was reading. So I'm in college, I'm an English major. My primary mentor, in college, who was also an undergraduate student, was training to be a minister in the Nation of Islam. I knew him initially as Donald Smith. He eventually became Donald Muhammad, while we were in school, and eventually was the head of the Nation of Islam for the city of Buffalo. And, he took me under his wings. I never joined the nation. I was always kind of Nation of Islam adjacent. But the biggest thing that he did is he gave me this voracious reading appetite for Black history and Black political history. So he hands me a copy of Hakeem Mahboudi's Enemies, the Clash of Races, that I carried around with me for 20 years, so much so I had to get it replaced because it was so torn and tattered. I read books like Chancellor Williams' The Death of Black Civilization. I was reading all these great books, right? And suddenly when I heard Public Enemy, I finally heard a music that was a soundtrack to what I had been reading and what I had been learning on my own, right? I talk
Mhm.
all the time about the separate education college education that I got in the E185 section in the library. This wasn't stuff that I was getting in classes, and at least until Public Enemy, it wasn't stuff that I was hearing in music, right? And then the other thing for me about this particular moment in terms of political rap, going to high school in Brooklyn from 79 to 83, traveling from the Bronx, it was in high school where I was first introduced to Five Percenters, members of the 5% Nation, right? I remember my dude, Brian Robinson, right, who was how I knew him. And by the time, he had taken on a Muslim name as a member of the 5%ers. And so when I first heard Eric B. and Rakim, right, it was language that resonated to me, right, because I had been grown up adjacent and around all these brothers who become members of the 5%ers.
Mhm.
So for me, this was music that finally reflected my own political viewpoints. And I always will say, and it's not that some of the greatest rappers haven't emerged in the last 20, 25 years, but for me, the real golden moment for hip hop from say 1988 to 1993, and it's not that the music was greater necessarily in that moment compared to any other 5 year period, but it was this period of time where you could get access to so many diverse versions of hip hop in ways that have become distinctly truncated when we think about the range and diversity of styles of hip hop, say from 2020 to 2025.
Yeah, because you had, for the mainstream folks, you had Yo on TV Raps, the weekend version with Fat Fat Freddy, and the daily version with Ed Lover, Dr. Dre. You
Yep.
had Rap City with hosted by the mayor, Chris Thomas, later Joe Claire, Big
Yep.
Les, and Big Tigger. But if you grew up in the tri-state area, you had Uncle Ralph, Lionel the Big Kid, and video music box where they played pretty much what Rap City was playing, what Yo MTV Raps was playing. Actually, Ralph McDaniels, I believe, had pitched video music box to
So
MTV.
BET, right? Yep.
They passed, which
Pass.
was a
Yep.
great call because it would have lost that independent feel, that
Absolutely.
regionalism that you necessarily couldn't have once you go mainstream. And it was where you saw other regional video shows say, hey, we're going to showcase where we're from, the artist that's hot.
Yep.
And if you didn't have that, you had the box. And I knew some of you probably risked it all to dial those three numbers and have that high phone bill. I never was. I was 7 or 8, and I only saw the box at my grandma's house because she had satellite. But I was never that bold to call 1-900, insert number here, pay $3.99 for a video. And it was the first video on demand service, if you think about it. And they had it coded based on what region of the country you were in, where you could see certain acts depending on your region of your country. Now, I want to still stay on hip hop for a minute. I want
Mhm.
to talk about the release of Outkast and Seven Player Listed Cadillac Music and how I felt it was one of those game changer albums because with me growing up in North Carolina and with Outkast coming from Atlanta and how the South was still looked at as, oh, they just do the booty music that Uncle Luke and everything going on down in Miami and thinking Southerners, we're not lyrical, we can't tell stories and paint pictures with words. And then, of course, the infamous Source Awards where Outkast got booed and Andre 3000 just pretty much put a rallying cry out there to the South, said the South got something to say. So what was it like for you when you first heard Outkast and realizing that Southern hip hop is here? And although you had before them 8 Ball, MJG, 3 6 Mafia, Ghetto Boys out of Houston, UGK, but it was really Outkast that really launched the ball for what was to be the dominance of Southern hip hop.
I'll be honest with you. I was not checking for Outcasts until Equimini, to be honest. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it was the region part, right? Again, I talked about the fact that I had these East Coast biases. So I really wasn't checking, for Southern rappers, right? The first Southern rappers that I hear, and this is even before Luke, is this rap out of Atlanta called Shy D. And I remember saying, like, I don't know what this is. I don't like this, right? Because it didn't sound like the hip hop that I was most comfortable listening to. And I understood, one of the things that Outkast particularly did on that first album, right, was sonically to sound a little bit, right, again, they're coming through LaFace and all that kind of stuff, to sound a little bit more around what the mainstream of hip hop was by that period of time, still a little East Coast bias there. But I think by the time you get to Equimini, not only had they finely tuned what their sonic presentation was, and the great storytelling. So that was really the first album of any Southern rappers that caught my attention, right? It also is that moment where I get introduced to CeeLo. And CeeLo, pound for pound, still might be, at least in terms of the Atlanta sound, my favorite rapper to come out of the South in that regard.
And then when you think about all the Southern rap acts coming out of Atlanta, Sam's Outkast, Getty Mob, Ludacris, T.I., all of that could be traced to where you had SOS Band coming out of Atlanta. You had Bobby Brown setting up shop in Atlanta with Bosstown Studios, which later became Stankonia. And
Uh-huh.
then the fire, I think, was lit in the backs of all the rappers that I mentioned who were probably growing up listening to Crisscross and Another Bad Creation, how they were moving gangbusters. And this was
Mm-hmm.
before, of course, organized noise and everything else. So I really think
Mm-hmm.
Crisscross and ABC really kind of planted those seeds for what was to later come with the rap explosion and also the success LA and Babyface had with setting up shop in Atlanta with
Right.
LaFace.
Right.
And that leads me to my connection back to the Bay. We mentioned Sly Stone. You were just in the Sly Stone
Mm-hmm.
documentary, Sly Lives, aka The Burden of Black Jeans, which is available on Hulu. It's a great watch if you have not watched it. And how Sly Stone, the great tradition of funk acts from the Bay, starts with him. And we can list all the funk acts coming from the Bay Area, but Sly Stone was the one, and how it was at a time where it was a rarity to have so many hands in the pot to be in different genres, and how it
Yeah.
was lonely at the top of that mountain. And what was it like for you hearing and seeing Sly and just knowing the journey he had to go through? And then once you see a Prince, that Prince pretty much followed
Mhm.
that template step for step.
So, my parents had 45s of Sly and the Family Stone, right? So I can remember at a young age hearing Family Affair and Everyday People. The first albums that they got from Sly, and the only two albums they had when I was a kid was the Greatest Hits album. They actually had that on 8 track. And so I grew up knowing Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself and Hot Fun and Summertime, which were both singles that were included on that Greatest Hits album. And then the other album they had was There's a Ride Going On. And I remember as a kid being absolutely enamored with the album cover. Not so much the music, right? My connection to the music comes later, but the album cover, the American flag, the look of the band, the look of Sly on the back. So I grew up knowing that Sly Stone was this person who was a celebrity. I hadn't really delved deeply into the music until I was in college and a little later. And the thing about what's important about Sly and the Family Stone and what they do in terms of the pop arena, when you listen to the work that Norman Whitfield does with the Temptations post 67, Cloud Nine, Ball of Confusion, all that stuff that he's doing for them, really up until Papa was a Rolling Stone and he leaves Motown, Whitfield does. He clearly is so impactfully responding to the sound of Sly Stone, right? He's trying to bring that Sly Stone sound, right, to Motown. It's also a moment in Motown, right, when you think about how they start to change their sound sonically. Folks forget that Plainfield, New Jersey's own George Clinton, who of course was born in North Carolina, was also writing songs, for Motown, right? He writes a song called "I Bet You" that both the Supremes and the Jackson Five record, right? Part of his critique of R&B, when he's calling R&B rhythm and bullshit, around his One Nation Under a Groove era, was the unwillingness of Berry Gordy to buy some of the songs that he wrote, right? Because Berry Gordy had a certain kind of formula, right? But all of this is really rooted in this impact that Sly and the Family Stone have. And it's important to remember they were not signed on one of the black labels, right? They were not Stax. They were not Motown. They were not, these early versions of what becomes, Philadelphia International Records. They were signed to CBS, right? They were signed by Clive Davis, right? They were on the same CBS that was giving us, the most mature and expansive sound of Miles Davis. They're the same CBS that would sign Carlos Santana. So they had a support of a record label, and in terms of promotion, they were always going to be a curiosity because they were a mixed race band, but also a mixed gender band. And by the time you get to 1969, when they record "Stand," and I always will make the argument that in terms of political music, black political music, "Stand" is one of the 5 most important records, albums ever recorded, right? Alongside things like Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" and things like that. It was such an incredible moment. I wish I was old enough to experience it more directly. Stan drops
Mm-hmm.
on 4. And so yeah, I'm hearing the music, but I don't get a fuller appreciation, obviously, of what kind of cultural impact Sly and the Family Stone had and the musical genius that Sly Stone was until later.
Mhm. And now when Prince debuts, you're kind of looking and saying like, okay, he's following almost step for step the formula of Sly. I just had Dr. Fink on my podcast, and we just talked about how, they followed the similarities with the Revolution, and how Prince was like, I'm gonna do it my way. I'm going to do it how I want to do it. You're not gonna micromanage me, and I don't care if it's gonna be a hit. Whereas opposed to Michael Jackson, he was very much in tune to this is for the people. I got to give the people what they want. While Prince was an artist.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that.
Hmm. Now let's jump to you leave Xavier. So where was your next teaching stop after that?
I spent 6 years at the State University in New York, at Albany, those were 6 years that were important to me, for a couple of reasons. One, it's where began to raise both of our daughters, my wife and I. But I always felt this need because of the great education I got. All three of my degrees came through the SUNY system. And I was given opportunities, that were intended for folks like me, working class kids, first generation kids. And I really loved those 6 years at SUNY Albany because it gave me a chance to give back to the SUNY system, to public education in New York State, what I had gotten from it. I always say, in comparison to the time that I would later spend at the University of Texas at Austin and in the last 21 years here at Duke, I still cherish those days at SUNY Albany, because those students needed and appreciated seeing a professor like me in ways that I have not experienced anyplace else, because they were all themselves first generation working class. And it mattered to them that their professor was someone who had gone through the same path, right? Had come from some of the same places that they did.
Yeah, representation matters because I can attest, first generation college student myself, went through Upward Bound. So when you're going
Mm-hmm.
through that undergraduate process and you don't see anyone that looks like you, especially if you go to a PWI, that's
Yep.
predominantly a white institution for those that don't know, and you're coming from a space where you feel like a fish out of water when you get to this environment and you don't know, do I belong? Can I hang? Can I be my authentic self? Do I not have to code switch? And when you
Mm-hmm.
see
Mm-hmm.
somebody that's in the same position as you and know the language and say, it's okay, young brother, young sister, you can be yourself. You don't have to put on no airs, no fronts. It feels like you can really go through your academic career at ease. Now, when you first got offered to come to Duke, did you know anything about North Carolina prior to, or were you like hesitant at coming down the Tobacco Road?
Nah, I mean, my mother was born in North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina. She and her family moved to Baltimore when she was about 10. So I knew about those her North Carolina roots, and there were still many of my aunts and uncles that were still living in North Carolina, though it's not like I visited to them. The other thing is that when I was younger, when I was in college and high school, I was a UNC fan. I was UNC, pro UNC, and more importantly, pro UNLV. So I wasn't trying to hear anything about no Duke basketball, right? When I was coming up, and I think about, not so much, those the first championships, like not that '86 run to the Final Four, but definitely those back-to-back championships and Christian Laettner and that whole deal. Um, I saw the way the media treated them as the program that did it right, with the athletes who were more analytical than physically endowed, and how they looked at UNLV, Greg Anthony, Larry Johnson, Stacey Augmon, right? They looked at them as if they were like a bunch of thugs, right? And again, the thing gets replicated again, when you got Duke, in comparison to the 5-4, I mean, the Fab Five with Jalen and Chris and all those kind of cats. So I was always sensitive, right, to that part of the kind of Duke, North Carolina, NC, North Carolina thing. But this is the thing, you know, we went to the university. I taught at the University of Texas at Austin for 1 year, 11 months actually, before Duke recruited me. And my wife and I knew that we weren't going to be in Austin long term, right? Because it was Texas. The only place that we had agreed that we both wanted to go, because I could have done California. She was like, nah. The one place that we thought we both wanted to do was the Triangle. And so when the opportunity came to Duke, it was a wonderful opportunity, right? And being in Durham, which I didn't know before I got here, this historically black city where actually my maternal great grandmother died in 1945, thanks to DNA, for being able to unpack stuff like that. The thing that I've loved about the region, and being in the triangle generally in North Carolina, more, in a general sense, said it was a great place to raise a family. It was a great place to raise a family. Coming from New York and even Austin, at least when we first got here, it wasn't as expensive as some of the other places that we had lived. And then it was nice to kind of get into the dynamics of the rivalry. Like, my daughter's going to public school. They both are riding hard for Duke because their daddy worked for Duke, and what it was like to go to school, the day before the rivalry. And some of these schools are like, well, you can't wear Duke and UNC gig because, we don't want no problems. It's been hard to explain to some of my friends who are still up in New York in the Northeast for them to really understand what that Duke UNC thing is.
Yes.
It
Yes,
is
sir.
so hard to describe to people. And I grew up in New York where, the Yankees versus Boston thing is real, right? The Yankees versus Mets thing is real. We know folks where the Michigan and Ohio State thing is real, but there's nothing like that Duke UNC because it's such the close proximity of the two schools and how that's integrated into everyone's familial and interpersonal relationships and professional relationships. It's just nothing like that.
Yes, because I still give folks a stank face if I see anything Duke related. Me being a 252 native, I'm a Tar Heel born, Tar Heel bred. When I die, I'll be Tar Heel dead. So it's either way you're a Dookie or you're a Tar Heel. But I give credit when credit is due. Duke gave us some bad boys. Hurley, Hill, Leitner, even though the NBA career was, he was on Dream Team. Jordan said, y'all can have him. We can tag him in. But Leitner was a bad boy. He can't make no rest stops in Kentucky. I know that's for sure. But you earlier about how look up the YouTube footage of Duke versus Kentucky when he hit the game winning shot. But prior to that, he stumped Timberlake
Oh,
clear,
absolutely. Yeah.
did not get ejected. And I think
Yep.
probably where the national hate started with Duke. But you mentioned, earlier with UNLV and the running Rebels with Larry Johnson, Greg Anthony, and all of those guys, and how they, along with those Georgetown teams with the late John
Yep.
Thompson,
Yep.
then go further back with Phi Slamma Jamma with Hakeem, Clyde. And then on the football side, you had the U and all the debauchery that was going on down in Coral Gables. And then the
Yeah.
Fab Five, and how it was where we're going to put Black culture on full display. And a lot of the folks in the suits and the boosters had a hard time dealing with that.
Yeah. No question. No question about that. I had the opportunity to participate in the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary, Why I Hate Christian Leitner. And one of the things I say in the film, right, because I didn't like Christian Leitner, right, but, he's this working class cat who comes outside of Buffalo where he grew up. But what I say in the film is like, I might not have hated, I hated Christian Leitner, but I hated Bobby Hurley more, right? And I had to soften my opinion about Bobby Hurley a few years later because he ends up coaching, my PhD alma mater, the University of Buffalo, and takes them to the tournament, right?
Mm.
And I will say that the first 5 years I was here in Durham at Duke, I was still not really a Duke fan. I still was not team Duke, and I certainly was not team Coach K. But the thing that shifted it for me was having some of the players in my classes, in particular Nolan Smith, who was a triple AS major and who I got to know very well when he was a student afterwards. And when, because for those first 5 years, I didn't see any basketball players in my classes. It wasn't until Nolan took a class, that I, had a black ball player in one of my classes. And, the decade that I co-taught the history of hip hop with Ninth Wonder here, it was always amazing, right? I can remember, all the folks who came through the class. I'm thinking about that class with Cam Reddish and RJ Barrett and
Zion.
Zion. Um, I still got the picture I took with Jason Tatum the last day of class, that the year that he was here.
Mhm.
Um, all these folks who, Giles, I mean, all these folks who came through. Duke in that regard, and there really is no comparison. That combination of academic reputation with athletic reputation. The school that's really closest is probably Stanford, but Stanford's ain't got no Jason Tatum's, Zion
Yep.
Williamson coming through. And yeah, we could talk about SEC football and now SEC basketball, but anybody talking about the academic standards of Alabama or Auburn, the
Nope.
same way they talk about Duke and Stanford, right? So it's a really a unique experience and has been, teaching some of these young student athletes, over the
Right.
last 20 years.
Now, with that picture with Tatum, was his hairline Chris? Because I never see Tatum without a whack hairline. His hairline should be a prospect member of Kappa Alpha Psi. I don't know if any Kappa members are probably hitting him up saying, "Hey, what's your shimmy looking like? What's your strutting
He
looking
was
like?"
wearing a cap. He was wearing a cap.
Oh, he was wearing a cap. So, what was it like for you finally to see Tatum break through and finally get him one last year, raising banner number
I
18?
I was so happy for him. I remember the last time I saw him, uh, classes were just about to end, and my wife and I were getting our car washed. He was getting his car washed there too. And I remember joking with him. I was like, "Well, I hope the Knicks draft you, right?" Which didn't happen. But he was. The thing I will say about all of these because I knew them as kids. Um, they were all good kids. They understood why they were at Duke, and they performed as students in the ways that they could and were allowed to, given the kind of demands on their time. He was such a good kid, generally speaking, when
Mhm.
he was here, and it's borne out through his career. You've never heard anything about controversy or missteps, right? I mean, it speaks to, how he was raised and all those kinds of things. And I know that was always one of Coach K's things, right? He wanted to recruit kids that came from quality families and quality backgrounds, whether or not it was single parent or not.
Mm.
So I was really happy that he finally reached the pinnacle of the sport and to get that championship.
Yeah, I mean, it was a perfect year cap off for St. Louis. He got him a ring. Shabuzi sampled Jaquan. Nelly got back with Ashanti. I mean, St. Louis is winning right now. So I want to go with Coach K for a minute. And how, at least for me, I think the rivalry between Duke and Carolina really went head to head for me growing up with Coach K and Dean Smith. And I think it was Tom Butters. I think that was the AD that decided against pressure from the Iron Dukes, we need to
Right,
get rid of Coach K because Coach K really was a hitting for his first couple of years, but it wasn't until
right,
the 86 class with Jay
right.
Bilas,
Johnny Dawkins.
Johnny
Yep.
Dawkins, Tommy Amaker, and those guys that really set the stage for Grant, Bobby, and those guys, even though the 86 team lost to Never Nervous Purvis Ellison and the Louisville Cardinals, rest in peace, Denny Crum, and just how, when you think of basketball brands, Duke is the brand, Carolina, the brand, and how we're like peanut butter and jelly. We go together. You can't have one without the other. And the crazy thing with the Duke Carolina rivalry is that a lot of the guys tend to roll in the same social circles where you might use the same barber. You might go
Right,
to the same hangout spot. Do kids even go outside and go to nightclubs now? I mean, I saw a picture of old night spots from I went to school in Greensboro, UNCG, and saw a lot of the defunct night spots. They're just vacant and empty. I'm like, man, you had to be there. Tall tees, the element in the building, DJ having to turn the music down, say, hey. I don't know. With you seeing college kids coming in now, do you think that culture is still there, or do you think kids now are so plugged into the social media and their phones that they don't really have that element of going outside and being amongst community like that?
I think it's really different. Times that I've talked to Grant Hill about his experiences, 3 years he was here at Duke, and he talked all the time about the Duke guys, the UNC guys, the NC Central guys, right? They all knew each other. They hung out. They went to the same house parties, right? Because you're a black student at with the exception of Central, right? But you're a black student at a predominantly white school. You looking for the black parties, and the best place you were going to find the black parties were at Central, right? So it just makes sense. I think the way that they're raised as ball players now, I'm sure a lot of them know each other and connect with each other from AEU stuff. But I don't get the sense that there's that kind of social environment for Duke players versus UNC players. I mean, they know each other, but I'm not sure they're hanging out the same way, right? And
Yeah.
some of these cats, that the lesson of Zion, walking onto campus, not even taking one class, not even played one college game, but already had 1 million, Instagram followers. That's just a totally different experience from what Grant would have experienced, 20 years, 30 years ago.
I mean, college students now, you don't know the struggle of having to make a large Domino's pizza stretch for 5 days because your refund check ain't hit. You don't know the struggle of knowing the cafeteria lady up front where you can't swipe. Like, go ahead, baby, get you something to eat. Or going to your local chicken shop, Bojangles, Popeyes, churches, whatever, saying, hey, I know y'all about to close, right? How much is it for y'all leftover chicken? And then hustle by selling it for X amount of dollars, or pooling money with your friends. Say, okay, I got 5. Okay, you got 10. You got
it's
5.
it's a
Let's all
different
go to the
game.
drive-through and let's get some.
I remember a few years ago, one of the students who's in my class, who I won't say his name, but he plays for the Mavericks, um, and not that one for the Mavericks, not the point guard. But I'm walking across campus and I see this giant Lincoln thing driving up, and me is like, "Hey, what's up, Professor?" I'm looking and I'm going, "Oh, damn, the game didn't change, right? These cats ain't driving around in little Toyota Corollas no more. They driving around in Expeditions, right?"
Nah, it feels like the program and blue chips are coming home to roost. So, what's your take on NIL and seeing like how you said the game doesn't change, where cats are getting the 30,000 in cash in the duffel bag in the tractor? Shout out to Ricky Rowe and asking, "Will my mom still keep her house and job?" Shout out to Coach Penny Hardaway, aka Butch McCray, or I don't want no Lexus, Neon Badeau, or let me go ahead and take this money until you see the light. Alvin Mack from the program, best all fictional movie linebacker of all time. And just knowing how kids are coming in now with a big bag, and they necessarily don't need to jump to the league because they can make a good amount of money in college. I know Cooper Flagg's going to make somebody rich in a couple of months when he be the first draft pick to somebody's team.
So, I'm of a couple of minds. I see college athletes, particularly in revenue generating sports. They're not just students, right? They're employees of these institutions, right? Mm-hmm. Their lives are totally different. My daughter was a competitive swimmer, 4-year scholarship student. The kind of demands on her time are very different than the demands of a football player at UNC or a basketball player at Duke. It's just 2 examples. So I think we needed to find a better way to make sure that they are compensated for the money and the visibility that they bring to the institution. So on that level, I'm absolutely supportive of what NLL does, though I do understand it really only impacts players who are in revenue generated sports. And even then, the best players, within the context of that. I'm sure there's some swimmers at some Big Five, Big Five teams in some of those conferences. I'm sure there's some golfers, some tennis players, right, who are making a great amount of money, NIL. Right? I get all that kind of stuff. And I think it was really important in terms of women's athletes, what we've seen in terms of women's basketball players, that there was an incentive for them to stay in college for 4 years because they were going to make more money, right, at least at the time, playing in college than they would ever make, for instance, playing in the WNBA. That being said, I do have concerns about some of the stabilities that some of the athletes have. You look at this year's Duke team, there are only 3 or 4 players and only 2, scholarship students who came back from last year's team, either folks going on to the league or going into the portal, like Jeremy Roach, right, who had been here for 4 years and by all rights should have graduated with a degree in African American studies, last summer, but went into the portal and that's that. Um, so I do worry about, if you're a fan of Duke basketball, right, you're never going to see that player that you're going to meet as a freshman and get to grow with them for 4 years, right? Those days are over. And I think we unfairly talk about these NIL players in this context, right? Because it really is reflective of what generally is happening in society. You can't talk about NIL separate and distinct from looking into the political realm, right? And looking at the impact that Citizens United has had on our election process. Right, that's we think about them in 2 very different kinds of spaces, but it is reflective of what is happening in our society, around money and activities that in the past where there were limits on the kind of money that would circulate. Think about betting in terms of what it looks like in terms of professional and also college sports. It really is just reflective of where we are at this time, right? I'm happy, particularly for those players, black, white, or whatever, who are coming from working class backgrounds, impoverished backgrounds, for which their success um, has an impact on the quality of life for their families, right? And for them to be able to make money as college students, knowing that there are always going to be risks to injury that are going to put into jeopardy the kind of money they can make as professionals. I think it is important that they're able to generate the kind of money that they can generate now.
Yeah, especially if you're gonna go pro in something other than sports. I mean, that Bojangles cookout endorsement deal is probably gonna be the biggest bag you're gonna
Absolutely.
get. But
Absolutely.
I wonder when Bill Belichick first got down here, I wonder if he threw up at the first site where somebody took him to cookout, and he was probably was looking at the cookout menu like, let me just get a burger, lettuce, pickles, tomato. I'm like, let me tell you, if you have not experienced cookout, if you have not been to cookout, as a North Carolina native, I will tell you, know what you want before you go because
Go up
you
there,
don't
right?
have time to be looking at the menu and staring. And also, the Bojangles that's getting expanded to other part of the countries, it is not the real deal. They just have chicken supremes, no bone in, no bowberry biscuit, no Cajun filet biscuit. It ain't the real deal. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. And also the biscuits. You gotta go to the right location. If you got somebody that's been in the back cooking for about 20 years, they know what they're doing. But if it's somebody that still got the trainee apron on, definitely don't do that. Now I want to circle back real quick. We talked about how, the North and the South meets with the Great Migration and how
Uh-huh.
it feels like sometimes folks, when they go down south for the summer to visit their country cousins, they treat it like it's a prison bid. Like, where they going? Oh, they going down south. Oh, she got in trouble, right? Yeah, she going down south. They look at it like it's the electric chair. I mean, some parts of the South is not as great. I mean, do we have our subtle racism? Yes, we do. Do we have certain parts you know not to go to? Yes, we do. As long as you make sure you don't go where you need to go, it'll be fine. But when I was looking at the Henry Louis Gates
Uh-huh.
piece, Great Migration, People on the Move, they talked about Soul City and how, for me, I always heard about Soul City as a kid, growing up in rural northeastern North Carolina, Halifax, North County area, and I would always drive by the marker going one
Uh-huh.
through Warren County, going on 85, going to Greensboro, and seeing the marker of Soul City, but never really knowing the full story
This was that.
behind it and how it was to be a utopia. But of course, Jesse Helms and all the good old boys at the time said, nah, we ain't gonna have that, and they end up kiboshing that, and just how it felt like in the 70s or so, a lot of people said, okay, we're going to come back to our roots, reclaim the South, and be able to make it our own. And that's where you see the influx of blacks coming back south. Then, of course, moving down to Atlanta, where you had Maynard Jackson as mayor, and just really making bones for themselves and reclaiming what was once a place of hostility is now considered a place of prosperity, the land of milk and honey, if you will. So your take on that?
No, I think that's real. I mean, as the documentary talks about and historians have been talking about for a while, we have this dramatic shift first during World War II and then first during World War One and then post World War II that creates this tremendous demographic shift in Black America, right? We don't get hip hop without one, Southern migrants moving up north to places like New York, and then of course the 1965 Immigration Act, right? So it really is this kind of melding of Black Northern culture, Black Southern culture, and Black Caribbean culture, right? Including Spanish speaking Caribbean, that creates this thing we call hip hop, or this thing that we think of as urban culture, from 1965 on. But as early as 1970, right, we start to see a reversal of Black folks who have decided it's too cold, amongst other things, right? We don't have the kinds of institutions, right? We can't grow stuff, we can't raise animals, right? Just not feeling fit for it, right? And it wasn't the utopia for some Black folks, right? Particularly if you didn't have money. It wasn't the same kind of utopia that you might have experienced in the South or imagined that you were going to experience when you left the South. So what we have seen is a reverse trend over the last 50 years of folks who had moved north, moving back down south. And, I think I've often, this is a conversation I have with my colleague, Regina Bradley, all the time. It's like, I don't really make a distinction in my mind, at least intellectually, between Black culture and Black Southern culture, because in my mind, all Black culture is Southern culture, right? As you rightfully, depicted, right? Even for those generations of folks who had moved up north, there were always kids going back south, right? You were always going back south for a family reunion or someone's birthday. Like my mother's parents, my mother's mother, her family eventually settled in Baltimore, right? And Baltimore is this kind of weird kind of, it's not northeast, it ain't the north. There's still a lot of kind of, southern about Baltimore, as is the case with the DMV, generally speaking. But we went down to Baltimore 3-4 times a year, right? So it wasn't like these were foreign places, right? So I think Black culture has always been a Southern culture. The question that I have now that I think we have to start grappling with, seriously, is as we consider where Black people are and where we might go in the future, right? We have to have serious conversations about climate change, right? When you see what's happening, just an example of Eastern Carolina and flooding, places like Princetown. Climate change is a real thing in many Black spaces, right? And they're Black spaces because someone understood, right, that they would be a buffer from white property, right, by being in these
Mm.
particular places, right? And then when we see what happens in Asheville, you understand there's actually no real logic, right? Both Asheville, right, in terms of the flooding, but also the fires, most recently out in LA, right? All of that went against all the presumed logic of how these things happen. And so climate change, I think, is going to, despite the political realities of the moment, which is a big deal also in terms of where you want to live.
Mm.
Nobody's Black's trying to move to Texas, like as one example, or Florida or something like that. Climate change, I think, is going to have a real impact on where we end up building and sustaining our roots going forward.
Yeah, and then, back to the hip hop piece and how a lot of people from up north would go to HBCUs and would bring those
Absolutely.
mixtapes down. And it was like trading
Absolutely.
cards were like, okay, I'll trade you
Absolutely.
Rap Attack for this local radio guy. I'll trade you for that. So it was where you had that community and that bond, and you're able to sample, okay, this is what's going
Absolutely.
on in that region. This is what's going on in that part of the neck of the woods. And then you know, being from North Carolina, I always felt that for a minute we were trying to be like Atlanta or New York or LA because we were right in the middle
Middle.
of
Right.
everything that we got
Yeah.
everything from everybody. We had Ski Beats, with original flavor and his later work with Jay-Z, Reasonable Doubt, Camp Low. And
Uh-huh.
then of course Jodeci on the R&B side, doing
Mm-hmm.
everything with Uptown. But to me, I really felt North Carolina hip hop didn't really get truly respected until Little Brother. So can we
Yeah.
talk about Little Brother, their impact, then your relationship with Knife Wonder, and how did that come about?
So there were some younger cats um, who told me about Ninth Wonder before I knew who Ninth Wonder was. Particularly like this young cat was like he's working with Jay Z, yada yada yada. And then when I first got to Duke, there were students here who told me, right, well, you got to check for Little Brother. So I was aware of them at least, the first couple of years I got here. But I met Patrick Ninth Wonder. We did a radio broadcast at the old WUNC studio when it was still housed over in Chapel Hill before they moved to the new American Tobacco space. And the first time we met, I of course knew his music, knew the work he had done with Jay Z, and we were just having a general conversation. And there were two things that happened in that conversation that made us lifelong friends. One, we talked about being the fathers of daughters, and he was joking about going on school trips with his daughter, both of them, right? But the oldest daughter at that time, and talking to other parents, like, "What do you do for a living?" And he would go, I'm a DJ, right? I'm a producer. I produce rap music. I'm with Little Brother," and they would look at him crazy because, like, in their mind, they couldn't imagine that someone who was quote unquote a rapper actually took school trips with their kids. Right. So we had a big laugh about that. But then we had a conversation about what our favorite hip hop song was. And it's Pete Rock and CL Smooth's "They Reminisce Over You," and that made us friends for life. And so we had done a couple of different things, panel discussions and things like that. And when his time at North Carolina Central, working with Christopher Martin, came to an end, he reached out. It's like, I'm not going to be teaching at Central anymore. You think anything can happen at Duke? And so we brought him over to Duke for the first time to teach a history hip hop class. It started as a class called Sampling Soul, which we co-taught. We did that for like 3 years, and then we segued, into this history of hip hop class. And it was an amazing partnership. Starting out with him just teaching that one class once a semester, and now to the point now where he teaches 3 classes at Duke. He does a history of hip hop class now by himself. We don't co-teach it anymore, not since 2020. But he's also doing a hip hop cinema class, and he also does a production class. Right? He donated 50 of these sampling machines to Duke back in 2018. And so he does a small production class with about 18 students. Each one of the students have their own sampling machine to work on. It is one of the courses that signs up the fastest at Duke, right? The history hip hop class generally has around 125, 130 students. The cinema class generally has around 50 students. And it's been great, to have him as a partner, doing stuff around popular culture and music and hip hop, for the last, now 15 years here at Duke.
Yeah, so for me, I first heard of Little Brother as a freshman at UNCG, working at the college radio station WAG 103.1 FM, and there was a copy of The Listening. And when I first heard it, I was like, what is this?
Yeah,
And to kind of hear how they're from that lineage of De La and Tribe, the whole native tongues, and I was like,
absolutely.
I got to
Yeah.
hear more. So this was back when you had to use a CD burner. So I had to have the production director burn me a copy of The Listening, and then that led up to the minstrel show and foreign exchange and everything to come after that. So ninth, if you're listening, I don't know if you're listening or you're watching, I got room for you. We could talk about that River Roulette and how you cooked up those beats. Come on, Ninth. I'm waiting for you. If you want, we can how you want it, dog. Like Denzel said, how you want it, dog. I could get real surgical with the music. I could get real surgical with Duke, Carolina. We could go many ways. Now, I want to tie in to seeing how now with the climate that's going on, we're not a political show, so we're not going to go too deep in the weeds, but this is related to, with you being in academia, how, DEI is being under attack and how courses, how anything different is being looked at as scary. We don't want it. So how do you combat that and give the students a safe space to say, Okay, you still matter, even though outside is telling you otherwise.
So, you know, there's no question that this is kind of an unprecedented kind of moment for many of us in our own lifetimes. It's not unprecedented in the history of American society and American culture, but for many of us, it's the first time we're experiencing this in our lifetimes. My own MO at this point in time is that I'm going to do what I've always done until someone tells me that I can't. And even when someone tells me that I can't, I will find a workaround. You know, Duke is protected in some ways because it's not a public institution, right? But Duke, still gets a great amount of federal money from for NIH and all these other kind of things that they do in terms of medical research and things like that, but that have ramifications on what Duke can do as an institution in other arenas, right? So I'm not going to say that this is not a challenge, but for me, in terms of dealing with students in the classroom, is to remind them that this is not brand new to Black folks. At a time when there were no Black studies departments anywhere in this country, certainly not at PWIs, going back to a longer history in which, Black folks were denied literacy, Black folks still learned. Black people still build, Black people still organize. The great examples of the mid 20th century of freedom schools, where the education that we knew we weren't getting as a community in these public schools, K through 12 and even college, we created a context in which, we could make sure people were in reading groups and learning things outside of those spaces, very often in Black churches and other institutions on weekends and after hours, right? We have to really get back to an ethic of community learning, right?
Mhm.
Where we're using the resources that we still have access to these institutions, white institutions, to make sure that folks who never will have access to these institutions, will be able to benefit from some of our knowledge and some of the information that we have.
Yeah, and then when you look at the roots of history, if you know the movie Normal Way, that was about Crystal Lee Sutton, who was from Vernon Rapids, North Carolina. I'm from that area, so I know the story well. At the J.P. Stevens plant, my granddad worked as a machine operator at that particular plant. And then, of course, you have Ella Baker,
Uh-huh.
co-founded SNCC, went to Central, born out raised outside of Littleton, North Carolina. Shout out to the 252, Halifax County. Then, of course, the Greensboro Four and to see
Mhm.
then how North Carolina really played a role in a lot of pivotal moments in and around, civil rights, labor
Uh-huh.
unions, and just how, we're more than just the home of Michael Jordan, Pepsi, best barbecue in the world. I'm biased. I will say that with my full chest. North Carolina has the best barbecue in the world. Eastern North Carolina, not Western North Carolina. Let's be very specific. Now, do a lot of your students or anybody in particular, do they know about the secret game with Duke and Central and with Coach McClendon at Central and how they had to really keep it covert and under wraps because it was a course where racism was still floating around.
It's some students know about it, not all the students. It's something I mention often. John Hope Franklin writes about it in his books. There have been movies done about it. I know members of the basketball team are aware of that story, as they are aware of the kind of interesting history between the Duke family, the Duke Endowment, and Black institutions in North Carolina, whether it's Johnson C. Smith or Hayti. But so I think there are folks who are more aware of that. I'm not sure a lot of younger folks who are in Durham. I know the old heads in Durham know the story, right? But I'm sure a lot of the influx of folks who've moved into Durham over the last 15 or 20 years are not, don't know anything about, the secret game.
Right. And then with the influx of the new basketball players coming every year with Coach Shire taking the helm is almost where it's like they kind of come in knowing once you put that Duke uniform on, you're representing those that came before you that walked these grounds. that practice, and you got to pretty much put the same effort 100% in that they did because Duke is such a legacy brand, just like Carolina, that anything short would be a failure because of the standard that the guys before them set and what Coach K said.
It's funny. When I look at the trajectory of the team the last decade, I went from not having a lot of contact with Coach K at all, to having more contact with him in those last couple of years, right? So, you know, when COVID happens and the George Floyd thing happens, and he does a giant brotherhood meeting on Zoom, and he invites myself and Ninth Wonder in to talk a little bit about the history of Black Durham and the relationship of the basketball team. When the students themselves have a protest, Black Lives Matter protest outside of Cameron in August of 2020, and to be there with Coach K and watching him stand up there and go Black Lives Matter, it's one of those things that most folks thought they would never ever see right in their lifetime, right? Because folks always thought he was a closet Republican. I mean, all these kinds of things, right? But the one thing I will say about when Coach Shire, when John took over the team, he was very conscious of, because he was one, what this generation of players look like, what kind of issues are going to be compelling issues for them, to loosen some of the reins that had been part of the Coach K moment. I've been fortunate, along with my colleagues Javier Wallace and also Tracy Canada, who you should talk to also. We have spent days, June of 23, June of 24, traveling with the basketball team, to Haiti, talking about the history of that. This past summer, traveling, to the Woolworth Greensboro Museum in Greensboro to talk about that history. These are things that didn't necessarily occur prior to John taking over as coach, right? So I think, this important connection between the basketball team and the history of Black Durham. I mentioned Javier Wallace, who you also should talk to, who now teaches in the program in education and has been really the person behind this film that looks at the life of C.B. Claiborne, who's still alive, but who was the first Black scholarship athlete at Duke, period, but was a member of the basketball team who sacrificed playing time, his senior year when he might have been thinking about, going forward professionally, but got benched because of his activities, supporting and being a part of the Allen Building takeover in 1969. So, Javier has been such a critical part of the history of that history of Black Duke basketball now being embraced by this current administration of Duke basketball, including bringing CB to campus to meet with the students regularly, to acknowledging him at a basketball game, to a documentary, right, that's being released about his life and his time here at Duke. So it's both a healing process on the one hand, but I think it's an important doubling down on Duke and at least the basketball program recognizing the history of what Black Durham is.
Yeah, I always like Coach K, and like Billy from Purple Rain told Prince, it's a business. It's a business that I didn't like Coach K. I loved it when I saw the L at the retirement party where we gave him that work at Cameron, and seeing him and all the love said that they were all the tears were just flowing. That was just about as good as you all losing to NC State to go to the Final Four last year. I mean, NC State, come on, son. NC State, they make their run every couple of years. I mean, they didn't win the ACC until last year, and that was right when Make It Last Forever and Pine State Milk was still in the store. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, Kevin Keats, you were about to be out of Raleigh, but you pulled a rabbit out your hat.
Yes, he
Lorenzo
did.
Charles and Jimmy V was definitely looking out for you last year.
Yeah.
But we need some of that
And
this.
one quick thing about Lorenzo Charles, I went to high school with him.
Oh,
He
you
went to
did?
Brooklyn Tech. He graduated the year before I did.
Oh wow, I did not know that. And it's crazy with NC State in that 83 team and how they made their magical run to Albuquerque to the pit where they beat Phi Slamma Jamma. That
Mhm.
I know originally Dominique Wilkins had wanted to go play at NC State because he was in Little Washington,
Uh-huh.
played at Washington, go Pam Pat, and how he ended up going to Georgia because, of course, this is back during the time where you did not leave Tobacco Road to go out of state. He went
Right.
down to the SEC in Georgia, and a lot of folks down there in Washington was like, nah.
Not
We
happy.
don't, we ain't having that. And then, of course, now Washington, you got Bam out of bio, who's
Right.
doing this thing. I mean, his waves are immaculate. I mean, his waves plus Jason Tatum's hairline plus
Yeah.
Tyrese's Halliburton hairline, that is Kappa Alpha Psi energy right there. So before we wrap, can we talk about any current projects you got going on, and where can people find you on the socials?
Well, I'll start with the socials. You can find me on Twitter. I refuse to call it X at New Black Man. You can find me on IG at Booker BB Brown, and you can do a search on me to find me on Blue Sky and also Threads. But the big project that I'm working on now is a book on Black fatherhood that should be out Father's Day 2026. So I'm looking forward to that. That's the work that I'm doing now.
Okay, yeah, we're definitely looking at that. And you can catch this interview wherever you stream podcasts and on the official YouTube channel at youtube.com/beyond the album cover. This has been a great interview. It won't give me enough to wear a Duke jersey or a hoodie because I'm still a Carolina fan. I got to do it on good principle. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you to Dr. Mark Anthony Neal for coming out to the podcast. Dr. Neal, thank you so very much, and you're welcome to come back anytime.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir.